I'm very grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to come and talk here today. You might not be very grateful to me by the time I've finished saying what I've got to say. I'm going to be pretty rude, I'm afraid. I'm going to blaspheme against many of your sacred tenets. But I hope also to begin to spell out a positive vision as well. Now, I'd like to start by asking you all a question. Could you put your hands up if you think the Amazon rainforest should be protected against cutting and burning and grazing? A few of you, thanks, yes. Put your hands up if you feel that wildlife in the Amazon would be best protected if the rainforest were converted to ranches. Not many takers. So why the difference? Why do the processes that we see as destructive and damaging to wildlife when we view them abroad appear to us as being beneficial and good for wildlife when we see them in this country? Why is it that cutting, burning and grazing, which are universally, except in Britain, recognised as being the most destructive processes of all, doing the most damage to wildlife, regarded as essential conservation tools in Britain? Why is it that we protect in this country the ranches against the rainforests? This is a rainforest country. A rainforest can be defined as a forest which is wet enough for epiphytes to grow, for plants which grow on other plants. And you don't have to walk many metres from where we are today to find polypody growing on the branches of the trees. What you're looking at here are tiny fragments of the rainforest which, in the boreal and Atlantic periods between about 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, when Neolithic farmers started substantially clearing them, pretty well covered Britain. It was more or less closed canopy rainforest from top to toe, and all the way down to southern Spain, as soon as it was warm enough to support it. And this has gradually been worn away until we find ourselves in the extraordinary position in Britain of having just 12% forest cover. The European average is 37%. And it's not hard to see how the difference arises. If you go to Europe, or even if you just look on Google Earth, you will see what you would expect to see. That the lowlands, which are where the fertile land is that's worth farming, are largely bare. That makes sense, that's logical. The uplands, which is generally where the infertile land, which is not worth farming, is, are largely forested. Again, that makes sense. And that is a pattern you'll see across almost all of Europe, except Ireland. Come to Britain, and you see that while the lowlands are largely bare, the uplands are even barer. They are virtually moonscapes. In fact, you would believe we were above the Arctic Circle. It looks like tundra up there. But this isn't a natural phenomenon. This isn't the result of the topography or the geography or the ecology. This is a result of us, of our impacts. How do you account for the difference between Britain and the rest of Europe here? It's not entirely clear, but it seems to me that it's largely a function of land ownership. Britain has, according to one estimate, the second highest concentration of land ownership in the world after Brazil, partly because we'd never had a revolution. While France was distributing its land, we were enclosing ours and increasing the size, the scale of land holdings. It's still going on today. In fact, we have a consolidation rate in England of 2%. That's the highest rate since the Highland clearances. Extraordinary things are taking place in this country, almost completely undocumented. No one seems to be interested, but remarkable concentration. And what this does is several things. One, it greatly empowers the very small landowning class, who are able then to pursue what are basically hobbies across vast areas of land. And I'm talking about grouse shooting and deer stalking here, both of which have absolutely devastating consequences where ecology is concerned. The burning, the culling of predators and competitors on the grouse moors, alongside a whole load of other destructive impacts, the grotesque overstocking of deer on the deer shooting estates. All these are basically reducing the land to almost nothing, destroying its capacity to support any but a tiny handful of wildlife. But it also means in the agricultural uplands that land holdings are big enough to make the harvesting of farm subsidies worthwhile. the harvesting of farm subsidies is the economic activity in the uplands. The sheep are purely ornamental. In fact, the sheep are worse than ornamental. They are substantially loss-making. The average farm subsidy received by hill farms in Wales is 55 grand a year. The average income at the end of the year is 33 grand a year. You lose £20,000 a year by chasing sheep across rain-sodden hills. What's not to like? But because the land holdings are big enough to make the income from subsidies worth living off, people here continue to keep the hills bare. You have to keep them bare to receive your subsidies. They have to be kept in what's called agricultural condition. If you've got permanent ineligible features on the land, which you and I know as wildlife habitat, that disqualifies it from farm subsidies, so you have a very powerful incentive to clear that land, to keep it bare in order to get your money. That's the economic model in the uplands. And this is why, I believe, we have this extraordinary, weird phenomenon, almost unique around the world, where the uplands are barer than the lowlands in places where trees can grow, where you have these upland moonscapes being developed. And the consequences of this are monumental in terms of wildlife, because the places where you would expect to find the great concentrations of wildlife, the functional ecologies, are the very places where it's been hammered hardest. One of the things which almost everyone missed in the State of Nature report published a couple of years ago was that while the rate of wildlife depletion on average across Britain is 60% over the past 50 years, in the uplands it's 65%. It's been even faster because of the intensification of management processes up there. And that's 65% from a remarkably low baseline. We're looking, and you don't have to go very far from here to see it, at places which have lost almost everything. Not just their trees, but also almost all their ecological function. They've lost nearly all their trophic levels, their steps in the food web, going both vertically and horizontally. They have a remarkably narrow range of life surviving there. The great majority of wildlife needs cover. Places to hide from predators, to ambush prey, to escape the extremes of temperature and humidity. They need structural heterogeneity, ecological architecture to create the various niches they require for survival. And it is almost entirely absent in such places. The broader, what I hate the term, ecosystem services, let's call it the functional ecology, that too has been comprehensively knackered by these devastating upland management practices, so that when it rains heavily, and it turns out to be a myth that the rain falls largely on the plain. Having lived in mid Wales for 5 years, I know that is untrue. They ensure that there are no trees to hold back the rain. So when a heavy rainfall hits, we get floods downstream. The watersheds have been trashed. The hydrological cycle has been broken by this very weird, anomalous, highly destructive management pattern that we have in this country, and that we celebrate and fetishize. And the conservation groups, which when they see it anywhere else, are saying, stop that cutting, stop that burning, stop that grazing. Saying, oh, we need cutting, burning and grazing to protect these precious natural assets where almost nothing lives anymore. You go to the Cairngorms and you see in a fairly recent study there that the upland woodland in the Cairngorms contains 13 times as many nationally important species as the moorland, the heather moorland. 11 times as many as a rough grassland. Now, when we see habitats like moorland and grassland elsewhere, in other words, low, wiry, perennial scrub, rough grassland, we recognise that they result from the repeated clearing, cutting, burning, grazing of former rainforest land, and we see them as a sign of extreme degradation. In this country, we celebrate them, and we regard them as conservation priorities. Instead of trying to restore what we have lost, we maintain the loss, and we maintain the ecological destruction which caused that loss. An extraordinary state of affairs, and in my view, a massive failure of vision on the part of our conservation organisations. And I'm sorry to say that the national parks are among the worst offenders. Not only through actual practice, but also through the story that they tell the public, constantly telling us that this is a desirable ecological state of affairs, that wildlife is thriving in these places. Whereas in some respects they're scarcely better for wildlife than multi-storey car parks. They are disasters. And yet we are constantly educated through a system which amounts almost to propaganda, in the idea that what anyone with outside eyes, any foreigner can see, is a place which has been completely wrecked, is a place which is in fine health, in fine fettle, and it should be maintained that way. National parks, they would be better designated as ecological disaster zones. 9 out of 15 of our national parks are basically ranches. Mostly for sheep, sometimes for ponies. As you'll see, not very far from here, they have been sheep-wrecked. They have been comprehensively shagged by the White Plague. A tenth, the Cairngorms, except for an area on the western side, and I have to say the Cairngorms are way ahead of most others in trying to do something about this, apart from that area on the western side, have been reduced to almost nothing by the grouse moors and the deer stalking. And yet, where is the upwelling, the upsurge of interest from the national parks to try radically to change this? We hear about forest restoration projects, and indeed a recent document was talking about large-scale restoration. It's tiny, minuscule in the grander scheme of things. I've heard national park staff boasting about the fact that their park has been awarded Category 5 status under the International Union of Conservation of Nature. Now, Category 5 was invented in order to accommodate and validate our national parks because they didn't fit into any of the other categories in which national parks fit, which are generally categories 1 and 2, places where you can find wildlife. It exists in some of those other parts. So here we had to invent Category 5, a sort of designated ecological disaster zone described as a national park, in order to have a place to put Britain's national parks. And to me, this is a grotesque sign of failure. Category 5, I believe, makes a nonsense of the idea of protected areas altogether. I mean, it's, you could call it a land use category, various forms of land use, but the idea that it's an ecologically protected area, to me, is just nonsensical. But the harsh truth is, we have only Category 5 areas, there's nowhere else. And what that means is that it's not just really bad for wildlife, but I think it's bad for human life as well, because we can't escape the intensive impacts of human management. Wherever we go, we bump into this ordered, regulated, controlled human system, which is what we live in all the time. We live in this grid of intensive human management in every other aspect of our lives. Surely we should have some places in this country where we can get away from that. Why are we to be deprived of that? And yet, that is, unfortunately, the current state of affairs. Now, of course, I recognise that there's more than one objective at play here, and that Britain's national parks have got plenty of people living in them and economic activities taking place in them. I recognise that you must balance natural beauty, wildlife, and cultural heritage as well as economic activity. But I would argue that the balance is wildly out of whack, that it's all on one side of the scales and almost nothing on the other side of the scales. And that what is promoted as cultural heritage, which incidentally is something that I value greatly as well. And I'm not coming here for a moment to argue against the value of cultural heritage, of local distinctiveness, of language and dialect, of traditions of various kinds. I too see the value. But we have an incredibly narrow and restrictive vision of cultural heritage and indeed cultural landscapes in this country, which is particularly promoted by the national parks. And sometimes this cultural heritage looks more like what the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci described as cultural hegemony. The ideas that suit the dominant classes being universalized so that everybody adopts them and absorbs them as the norm. and sees those, what's good for the dominant class is good for us. And very often what I see is the national park effectively privileging a few thousand people, or even a few hundred people, the grouse moor owners, sometimes a few tens of people, the large sheep farmers, the deer stalking estates, and basically providing them with cover, giving them social, political protection against those who might challenge them by celebrating and fetishizing their destructive uses of the land. And I believe, I see that there are conflicts here. But I believe part of the problem is the national parks, even if they see that there are conflicts, they are not allowing us to see that there are conflicts. They're pretending that those conflicts don't exist. How many times have I seen in national park literature people talking about the sheep farmers being in harmony with the natural world? This is about the most destructive land use there could possibly be. If you look at the economic product versus the level of destruction, it's hard to think of a worse one except potentially scallop dredging. The tar sands of Alberta are nothing on this. In some of these places, you'll have 1 sheep per 2 hectares in many of the national parks. Those sheep are sufficient to ensure that not a single tree seedling grows, that you maintain a wet desert across vast areas, and yet that vast area cannot even support a family without massive lashings of public subsidy. Can there be a greater disproportion between economic benefit and ecological disbenefit than a sheep farm in the uplands? Probably not. And yet that is what's being provided with cover, and what we're being told is in harmony with nature. I mean, this is a constant theme in the Lake District. It's as if our ecological understanding had not moved on since Wordsworth. That we have this perfect republic of shepherds living in harmony with this great national heritage of ours, and yet the ecological reality is simply not being documented or expressed. We're not being honest about it. And I object to the fact that the clash of values is not being recognized. I'm not saying that there are not important values on both sides. I believe that there are. I understand the value that can be placed on the traditions of some of the farmers. So increasingly we're seeing absentee farmers with almost no stake in the land hiding behind those who have been there for ages and ages and maintain the traditions. But I still see that there is value there. But I see that those values clash with the values of people who would like to see wildlife protected. But that message never comes across. I have not seen it once in any literature of any national park. You guys are lying to us. You are telling us a bunch of fairy tales, unicorns and mermaids. It's total rubbish. And it's time you were much more honest about what you are telling the public. You also try to pretend that the sheep farming is the economic mainstay of these places. It's not. You don't mention farm subsidies, which are the economic mainstay. Again, why mislead people? And perhaps most importantly, you create the impression that there's only one kind of cultural landscape, and that's the one we happen to have at the moment, which has been created by the dominant land use forms, which has been created in turn by the dominant people in the land. I mean, people who own land now are tremendously powerful, and they're not selling it anymore. They're just, those who've got it are accumulating, they're shutting out new entrants, they're able to pass it on intact to their descendants generation after generation. There's no inheritance tax, there's no capital gains tax. These are incredibly privileged, powerful, and often extremely wealthy people. And it's through their lens that the landscape is being portrayed and protected and maintained in its current form. Now, I see some possible slow signs of change, certainly in terms of the rhetoric, and that's no bad thing. It's got to start with the rhetoric. It's got to start with the way in which we talk. In the document produced by National Parks England, called England's Wild Wonders, it does talk about large-scale restoration of forests and stuff. Unfortunately, what it actually shows you is very small-scale restoration of forests, but then it goes on to create the impression that everything is well, that we're looking after the wildlife is thriving in our parks, whereas nothing could be further from the truth. But I welcome and acknowledge the start which is being made here, and I hope very much that we can build in it. Because what it seems to me we desperately need for our own sanity, as well as the protection of the natural world, is a mass restoration of our highly depleted ecosystems in this country. We could call it rewilding. And what this means is allowing the trees to return to the hills. Not everywhere, but in some places, enough places to have substantial, significant areas, particularly the crucial watersheds, in order to protect communities downstream, as well as providing habitat for wildlife. It means bringing back some of the keystone species, the species which drive ecological processes, such as beaver, such as boar, such as lynx, perhaps in some places one day, such as wolves. These are not just ornaments of the ecosystem, they're absolutely essential to their functioning. And without those species, you have a pale shadow of what ecological health should look like. They're absolutely essential to the functioning of the entire food web. But in our complacent way, we seem to regard it as absolutely fine that we don't have them, or have them in hardly any places in this country. Surely the national park should be leading the effort of significant, sustained and meaningful restoration. We've got to make it work for local people, absolutely. And we have to demonstrate the economic value of this, but that shouldn't be too hard. The farm subsidies aren't going to last forever. In fact, it's hard to see how they've lasted this long. Look at us, we're facing this age of universal austerity where essential public services are being cut, and the European Union is spending 55 billion euros a year taking money out of the pockets of taxpayers and giving it very often to the richest people in the whole union. And the landowners in this country, among them, are the very richest people, not just in Britain, but in the world. We've got the world's first-class benefit tourists owning land in this country, Russian oligarchs, oil sheikhs. Some of them never step foot here, and yet they are paid literally millions of pounds of our money merely for owning the land. They are paid by the hectare. The more hectares you have, the more money you make. In the Middle Ages, they used to have this thing called feudal aid, where the vassals paid the landlord for the privilege of him owning the land, and the more land he owned, the more he was paid. That is pillar one of the Common Agricultural Policy. Even pillar two, I would seriously challenge it. I mean, a higher level stewardship. There would be a lot of places which would be returning to woodland and would be far more ecologically rich if it were not for pillar two, the supposedly green subsidies, which are maintaining a highly destructive industry in places which could otherwise be restored. But unjust, socially unjust as the current system is, grotesquely economically unjust, where we're basically being fleeced. Well, ordinary recipients of benefits have their benefits capped. In England, there's no cap at all. In fact, it was the very month, it was July 2013, where the government imposed the benefit cap on ordinary recipients, that it went to Brussels bellyaching against the benefit cap for farm subsidies. The cap for ordinary citizens at the time was £26,000. The cap the European Commission was talking about imposing for farm subsidies was €300,000 at the time, £260,000, exactly 10 times the benefits cap. And Owen Paterson managed to get that stopped, so it became a voluntary measure, not a mandatory one, with the result that people are still receiving millions in this country. But while we have a system of horrendous social injustice at the moment, I don't want to replace it with a different one. I don't want the communities in the uplands to be frozen out. I don't want them to lose their livelihood. But what I'm saying is that when the subsidies go, and it is when, not if, they're going to have to find something else to do if the communities are going to be sustained. Already, the traditional industries are manifestly failing to sustain income and employment. The schools are closing, the shops are closing, the chapels are closing, most importantly the pubs are closing. They're just not able to maintain their communities at the moment with those industries, despite the lashings of public money. When the public money goes, what's going to happen? So my argument is, get in there first. Start devising new ways of using this land. Start bellyaching for pay. I don't like the concept, but I can see how in the right circumstances it can work. Payments for ecosystem service, which are actually protecting nature in the round, large-scale ecological processes, and the mass restoration of wildlife as well. Start developing ecotourism businesses. Start competing to have the most interesting wildlife on your land. You know, well, he might have beavers, I've got lynx. Yeah, he might have lynx, I've got wolves. That's the sort of competition we need to start seeing. These things are difficult, the economic case needs to be made, but you know, the national parks, I believe, should be in the forefront of making that case. The national parks should be changing the way we see the land, rather than constantly bringing us back to seeing it in the old-fashioned and highly misleading way in which we see it at the moment. And they should be in the forefront of pushing for a radical restoration of the wildlife which we have so comprehensively lost in this country. Now, I believe you can do it. I wouldn't be here today if I didn't believe that. And I reiterate that I'm very grateful to be here at all. I might be hounded out when I finish this talk. Because I know that what I'm saying, of course, is highly unwelcome. Well, I mean, not unwelcome, but it certainly is going to make things uncomfortable. And yeah, I apologize for that, but I am genuinely grateful for being able to say it. But it's because I think you can be the leaders. I think you're in a fantastic position here. You've got the ability to reach so many people in such a radical and exciting way. I think you could be the great rewilders who change the face of Britain in a way that can be almost as much of a step change as the creation of the national parks was in the first place. This, I believe, is stage 2 of the national park mission, and I hope very much you'll embrace it. Thank you.